Do you think silence in a family says more than shouting?
I swear I did not wake up that morning planning to blow up an Easter lunch. But when Aunt Carol leaned across the table with that smile she reserves for family announcements and telethons and said, loud enough for the cousins in the next room to hear, that my brother Ryan had just gotten engaged and then, without even taking a breath, asked me when it would finally be my turn, I felt something slide into place inside me, something like a lock finally finding the right key, and I took a slow sip of my drink and said, as calmly as I say my coffee order, that I was already married and had simply chosen not to invite anyone who would roll their eyes. And the air went still in the way a room goes still when someone pulls the fire alarm and you are all deciding whether to pretend you did not hear it. The looks came one after another like dominoes, my mother blinking as if a contact had just shifted, my father going very quiet in that particular way he thinks counts as leadership, Ryan half laughing because he always laughs first and thinks later, and Aunt Carol clutching at the string of pearls that are not really pearls, but she acts like they are museum pieces, and I just kept my face neutral because I knew if I let even a hint of a smile slip out they would pounce on it, and, honestly, it was almost funny to watch them try to compute the idea that I could make a life decision without panel approval, as if I should have filed paperwork with the family group chat and waited for signatures. My mother recovered first, because she always does, asking me where, and when, and what church, and if there were pictures, and if the dress code was black tie, and then my father cleared his throat and asked what my husband did, and whether he loved baseball, and whether he had a yard for grilling, and I remember thinking that none of those questions were about me, that they cared about the optics and the box checking and the seating chart more than whether I was happy or felt safe, so I gave them nothing, a soft smile, and a longer sip and a little shrug that said I was not doing this dance, and the more I refused to perform, the more they leaned in, like kids pressing their faces to the glass of an empty aquarium. Ryan eventually found his footing and cracked a joke about how at least one of us had figured out how to keep a secret, which was rich coming from the man who once hid a whole failed startup from our parents until the credit card statements arrived. And when he lifted his glass to propose a toast to himself and his fiancée Jenna and to my mysterious husband, I clinked gently and told him I was rooting for them both, which was true in the way you root for your team to stop tripping over their own shoelaces, and in that moment I could feel Aunt Carol trying to decide whether to pivot into offense or stay in the lane of injured dignity, because there is nothing she hates more than a story she cannot narrate. I watched the wheels turn and I let them turn, because it was the first time in a long while that I was not the one being turned into a punchline, and while they whispered and speculated and tried to map my life onto their comfort zones, I thought about the years of little cuts dressed up as jokes, the holidays where my jobs were called hobbies while Ryan's hobbies were applauded as leadership, the birthdays where questions about my love life felt less like curiosity and more like an audit, and I realized I was strangely calm, not gloating and not shaking, just steady, because the sentence I had dropped on the table was not revenge for the sake of revenge, it was a mirror, and they were all finally forced to look into it. My mother tried a softer angle and asked if my husband's family lived nearby, and my father, who never misses a chance to talk real estate, asked if we were house hunting, and Carol, because she cannot help herself, asked if it was a courthouse wedding and whether anyone respectable had been present, and I said, with the kind of patience you discover after a long drive through traffic, that the people who needed to be there were there, and the people who would have rolled their eyes were not. And I left the rest hanging, because they have never once given me the benefit of the doubt and I was not going to start handing them details they could sharpen into weapons. Jenna, who has not been in the family long enough to understand the choreography, leaned in and said she would love to see photos whenever I was ready, and I looked at her and decided not to make her the enemy, because she does not know the history. She only knows the script she has been handed, and I told her that someday I might show her everything, which made Aunt Carol flinch because the idea of me sharing anything privately rather than on her stage is apparently offensive to her sense of order, and that was when I felt the relief wash over me, because I saw the power balance tilt just a little, saw that curiosity was now on my side of the table, and it felt like finally having the remote after years of watching the same rerun. Ryan asked if my husband was coming to the engagement party they are planning, and I said that would depend on whether the party was meant to celebrate or to compare, which made him laugh again because he cannot stand when anyone lobs a truth he cannot dismiss. And my father muttered that family deserves inclusion, which is a word he likes to use when he wants something to go his way, and I said that inclusion without respect is just attendance, and I do not owe anyone my attendance, and I meant it, even though saying it out loud made my palms go hot, because old habits do not vanish in one afternoon. Somewhere between the ham being carved and the pie being sliced, the table split into small committees, my mother whispering with Carol, Ryan texting under the table, my father asking Jenna about her parents. And I sat back and realized I had finally put something in motion that did not require their permission, because for once I was not explaining or defending or sugarcoating, I was choosing, and choosing felt like courage wearing comfortable shoes. Quiet and steady and entirely mine, and the more they scrambled, the more I understood that I had stumbled onto a pressure point I had never pressed. When Aunt Carol tried one last time, her voice honeyed in that way she thinks fools people, telling me that secrets create distance and that family needs clarity. I smiled in a way that let her know we were done performing for her audience and said that clarity would come when respect did, and I watched her face rearrange itself into outrage disguised as concern, and I knew I had landed the punch without even standing up. Because the whole table had felt it, that shift where I was no longer the kid waiting for grades from the committee, but the woman who could decide what information she released into the wild. On the drive home, I replayed the day and waited for the guilt to follow me through the door like it always does, and when it did not, when all I felt was this clean line of purpose, I understood that a single sentence had done more than score a point. It had opened a door. And on the other side of that door was a plan I had not let myself imagine, a plan where I stopped accepting the role they wrote for me and started writing scenes they could not predict, and as ridiculous as it sounds, I realized I was almost grateful for that loud question and that smug smile, because they handed me the perfect opening and I took it, and now I intend to see how far this goes. Because if a table full of people only respects a woman when a man is in the picture, then I am absolutely going to teach them what happens when the picture refuses to behave. And before this year is over, they are going to learn that I am not waiting for my turn anymore. I am taking it, starting now. If the Easter line was the spark that finally hit the dry brush I had been stacking for years without admitting it, then the day after was the moment I stopped pretending that the fire was accidental. Because when I woke up to a buzzing phone full of half-congratulatory, half-interrogating messages from relatives who only remember my birthday when Facebook reminds them and from family friends who treat my life like a community property newsletter, I realized I had been living on a scorecard I never agreed to keep, one where Ryan earned points for existing in the shape they recognized and I lost points for existing in the shape I actually am, and for the first time it did not make me sad or small. It made me organized, which is a much more dangerous mood for me. I can tell you the exact milestones where the math went lopsided, not because I want pity, and honestly I am allergic to pity, but because the pattern matters if you want to understand why I decided to let them chase shadows for a while. Why the silence I gave them after that lunch was not cruelty but calibration, like the day I graduated and Aunt Carol applauded my honors for exactly one sentence before pivoting to Ryan's summer internship like it was the moon landing. Or the Christmas when I brought a partner who had a real job and a steady life and Carol introduced him as my little phase, as if I were bringing home a hobby. Or the birthday dinner where my mother made a wish on my cake that I would finally settle down and I laughed because I thought she was being cute, except she was not. She was auditioning a line she liked for the next gathering. And when I finally protested, I was told I was too sensitive, which is always what people say when they want you to accept their rudeness as tradition. I am not blameless in this because I let it roll for too long. I played along with the jokes and fed the machine with polite smiles and helpful context and all those tidy explanations meant to defuse the moment. And I told myself that keeping the peace was the same as keeping my dignity, which it is not, and somewhere along the way I started narrating myself in their language, measuring my progress in their units. And if you have ever done that, then you know it feels like wearing a pair of Shoes that pinch in the same spot every single day, and you tell yourself the leather will stretch, and it does not, and then one afternoon you throw them out and decide you would rather walk barefoot than bleed in private. So I took a breath and I made a choice that will sound petty to anyone who has never been flattened into family entertainment and will sound like liberation to anyone who has. Because I opened my social media to the exact audience that treats Aunt Carol like a small-town mayor, and I wrote a simple paragraph that said I had gotten married quietly, and that it was peaceful and right, and that I had only invited people who knew how to be happy for me without turning my life into a panel discussion. And I attached no photos and tagged no one and added no further details, and then I put my phone on the counter and made breakfast, and I cannot describe the relief of not refreshing, because the point was not to win the comments. The point was to move the spotlight off their stage and onto mine, and leave it there until I decided otherwise. Within an hour, my mother called with a careful voice that always shows up when she knows the optics look bad for her, asking why I would make an announcement before sharing with family. And I said that family had heard me say for years that I do not like being teased about my life, and that they did not listen. And she started to say that teasing is love, and I interrupted and said that love listens the first time. And we sat in that silence that feels like a hallway with a locked door at the end. And then she asked when she could meet my husband, and I said the answer to that depended on whether the next family event would be a celebration or another roast, and she promised me it would be welcoming. Which is the word people choose when they plan to be polite but not accountable. By noon the secondary waves started hitting, not to me but around me. Because Carol's acquaintances and committee friends and the women she keeps orbiting her with favors and gossip began commenting on my post with those smiling daggers that say congratulations while slicing for information. And because they're her circle, they naturally asked why dear Carol was not there, and I swear I did not take joy in it the way a villain twirls a mustache, but I felt a settling in my spine that I have never felt with this family, because for once the pressure was not on me to overshare, it was on the person who has made a hobby of narrating my life like a cautionary tale, and that is when my phone lit up with her name, and I almost let it ring out. But I picked up, and she launched into this long speech about miscommunication and how mothers deserve to be included and how I had blindsided everyone and how rumors are so dangerous, and I waited for her to stop, and then I said very evenly that rumors are what happens when people try to pry open what is not theirs, and that if she wanted clarity she could start by acknowledging that the last few years had turned me into a punchline and that I was done being cooperative about it. She tried to regroup and offered what she calls a compromise, which always means I do the apologizing and she does the narrating, proposing that I send her a few photos she could share with her circle to tidy things up. And I said that was not going to happen because I had learned that the fastest way to lose control in this family is to give a little in hopes of winning a lot. And then she shifted tactics and asked for my husband's name and where he worked and whether his people were local. And I told her, still calm, that he had an allergy to eye rolling, and that was all she needed to know for now, and she did not like that answer, but she heard it. I know you want to ask whether I felt cruel, whether any part of me worried that I had crossed some line, and I will tell you the truth, which is that I felt the opposite of cruel. I felt precise, like I had finally matched the tool to the problem. Because what hurts a person who feeds on public performance is not being insulted, it is being forced to face a crowd without a script, and by the evening I had texts from cousins who have spent entire holidays pretending to be Switzerland saying they were sorry if they had piled on in the past and asking how to do better, which made me smile without gloating, because it is easier to be kind when you are finally being respected. For the record, I did something else that afternoon that felt small in the moment and turned out to be strategic. Because I replied in the family group text to Ryan's engagement message with a genuine congratulations and a promise that I would be there for the actual commitment. And then in the same breath I said that my husband and I were keeping our circle tight and would not be attending events where jokes at my expense were the entertainment. And as soon as I hit send I knew I had drawn the line where it needed to be, not with threats or theatrics, but with a boundary that came with consequences. And almost immediately Ryan called and told me I was making this about me, and I let him talk until he ran out of steam, and then I said that if he wanted his day to be about him he should start by telling Carol to stop using other people's lives as content. And he got quiet in a way I have not heard since we were kids, and he was caught doing something he knew was wrong. That night Carol called again with a voice that had lost its shine and offered what she labeled a reset, saying if I shared a few tasteful details she would help steer the narrative back to something flattering. And I told her that the steering wheel was no longer in her hands, and that if she wanted to be part of my life going forward, she would have to learn how to sit in the passenger seat without grabbing at the controls. And I could hear her breathing like she was trying to swallow words she could not say, and I ended the call by telling her I would think about letting her meet him soon, which is a sentence that bought me time and leverage, and after I hung up I laughed, not because I was mocking her, but because for the first time I felt what it was like to play on a field I marked myself, and I slept better than I have in years knowing that tomorrow I would stop letting them ask and start making them earn. Because if curiosity is the only language they understand, then curiosity is exactly what I will speak until they finally learn something. The funny thing about telling a lie that lands so hard it knocks the air out of people who are used to holding all the air in the room is that, once it leaves your mouth, you realize you are not actually lying for the sake of hiding. You are lying for the sake of finally being seen, and that is exactly what happened after Easter when I decided that if they wanted a mysterious husband so badly, I would give them one. Not in photos or documents or some paper trail they could fact-check, but in carefully chosen words that sounded solid enough to silence the gossip for a moment and vague enough to let their imaginations chew on it until they drove themselves half mad. I started slow because you cannot give away too much too soon, and honestly, the more you hand them, the faster they twist it into something ugly, so instead I learned to drop breadcrumbs in conversations without ever pointing to the trail. Like mentioning in the group chat that my husband was working late on a project he was leading and watching how quickly my father tried to ask what kind of project and for what company and whether it was local or global, and I would just shrug it off with something like, he's good at what he does, that's all that matters, and leave it there, and within minutes I could see from the read receipts that the cousins were privately messaging each other, because once you train people to undervalue you, they become obsessed when they think you might finally be holding a winning card. I noticed it most clearly at a family barbecue 2 weeks after Easter, when Aunt Carol, who cannot stand the idea of not being the one who breaks the news, leaned in front of a whole circle of people and said in her syrupy voice that she was so happy for me and that she knew my husband must be someone very special, and I smiled and said that he was. And then I pivoted the conversation right back onto Ryan's engagement as if I were being gracious, and the whiplash in her face was priceless. Because for once she had no ammunition, no punchline, no way to slice me open without looking cruel, and I felt something shift in the pecking order, not because I had proven myself, but because I had given them less than nothing. And nothing is impossible to control. The questions came heavier after that, with my mother calling under the pretense of asking about my work, but quickly veering into whether my husband's family lived nearby and whether they might host us all someday. And when I told her that we preferred to keep our circle tight, she tried the guilt card about how families need to blend, and I said, very calmly, that families blend only when respect is mutual. And she went quiet in that particular way where I know she is writing notes for her next conversation with Carol, and it struck me that I had been right all along. They were not asking to celebrate me, they were asking to control the narrative, and the less I gave them, the more frantic they became. And that frantic energy was finally theirs to manage instead of mine. I will admit there were moments when I almost slipped, when I almost said something too specific, because part of me wanted to watch them fall all over themselves trying to verify it, but I resisted because I knew the power was not in the story I invented. The power was in the silence that forced them to fill in the blanks, and the longer they filled those blanks with their own hopes or fears, the more they revealed about themselves, like Ryan texting me late one night to say he hoped my husband was not one of those arrogant types who looked down on people without graduate degrees, which told me more about Ryan's insecurities than I had ever managed to get out of him in 30 years of sibling rivalry. Or Carol asking if he was from old money or new, which exposed that her biggest concern was not my happiness, but her own social ladder. The best part, the part one savored quietly like a secret piece of candy you do not tell anyone about, was when people started treating me differently, not warmly, not kindly, but cautiously. The way you treat someone who suddenly has leverage you do not fully understand, and that was the moment I realized just how deep the rot of this family runs. Because all it took for them to finally look at me as someone worth respecting was the suspicion that a man had chosen me and that he might outrank them, and that realization did not hurt me the way it might have in the past. It fueled me, because I saw the absurdity of it laid bare, and I knew then that I would carry this charade all the way through until I was ready to dismantle it in front of them, brick by brick, just to show them the hollow house they had been living in. Of course, it was not long before the late-night calls began, Carol ringing my phone with that voice she uses when she wants to sound concerned, but cannot hide the edge of desperation, asking if maybe I was hiding him because he was older or divorced or not the type of man they imagined. And I told her, with the sweetest tone I could manage without laughing, that the only thing I was hiding was my peace from people who never offered me any. And she sputtered and insisted that family deserves transparency, and I countered that transparency is earned when you stop treating your relatives like entertainment, and the silence that followed was the kind you cannot buy, the kind that tells you the other person has run out of scripts. In those weeks I discovered something I wish I had known sooner, that control does not come from shouting or proving or begging for recognition. It comes from refusing to hand over the keys to people who only know how to drive your life into walls. And while they scrambled to piece together a puzzle I had drawn with invisible ink, I sat back for once and let them sweat, not because I enjoy cruelty but because I wanted them to taste what I have tasted my entire life, the feeling of being talked about instead of spoken to, the humiliation of being dissected by people who think they know better, and once they finally had a bite of it, I could see the discomfort grow, and that discomfort was the first real justice I had ever felt in that house. And just when I thought I had seen the peak of their agitation, Carol called again, late at night when she must have thought I would be softened by fatigue, and she asked in a voice dripping with false intimacy whether she could at least know his first name. Because apparently she needed something to hold on to in her conversations, and I paused long enough for her to believe I might crack, and then I said, very softly, that the only name that mattered right now was respect, and when she huffed and accused me of being theatrical, I let the silence stretch until she hung up, and I knew I had her where I wanted her, because people like Carol do not hang up when they win, they hang up when they know they cannot. That was the night I went to bed not plotting revenge out of anger but out of clarity, because I finally understood the difference. Anger burns hot and quick, but clarity is patient and surgical. And clarity was what told me that if I wanted them to feel the weight of everything they had dismissed in me for decades, then I would not just keep the lie alive, I would build it into something so undeniable they would beg to be let in, and then, only when they were desperate enough to believe, would I decide when to rip the curtain away, because nothing tastes sweeter than control handed back to the one person they never thought could take it. If there is one thing this family loves more than a celebration, it is the planning of a celebration with committees and assignments and little power pockets disguised as logistics, which is how I found myself added to a group thread that included my parents, Aunt Carol, my brother, his fiancée Jenna, and a rotating cast of cousins and neighbors who orbit big events like they come with frequent flyer miles, and while the messages flowed with suggestions about venues and playlists and registry items, I could feel the old dynamic trying to reform itself around me, the gentle ribbing that slides into open-season mockery, the questions that are really tests, the demand for details that they have not earned. And I heard the voice in my head that has always told me to play nice begin to whisper, and then I told it to sit down, because this was the moment to set the terms rather than beg for them. So when Carol asked if I could handle the dessert table like I always do, as if the only thing I can bring to a milestone is a tray of cupcakes and a smile, I took a breath and wrote a message that I knew would land like a handbrake on a downhill slide. And I kept the tone warm because I have learned that warmth cannot be twisted as easily as anger, but I did not dilute the point, telling the thread that I would be happy to contribute generously and show up fully, and that I would do so under 3 simple boundaries that should have been obvious, but somehow never are, which were that there would be no jokes at my expense, no comparisons between my choices and Ryan's, and no fishing for details about my marriage beyond what I chose to share. and that if any of those lines were crossed, I would leave quietly and without drama because peace is not negotiable anymore. And before anyone could claim I was trying to control a party that is not about me, I wrote that these rules are not about me at all. They're about respect for the guest list and the couple, because when a family turns a celebration into a roast of one member, everyone loses, and to make it easy I closed with a simple request that anyone who agreed could reply with a yes, which meant anyone who did not was announcing that disrespect was part of their plan. The first response was from Jenna, who, bless her, may not understand all the history but understands the cost of chaos when you are trying to build a life. And she wrote yes, and then added that she wanted her engagement party to feel safe and celebratory for everyone, and I could have hugged her through the screen, and maybe that is why the rest of them followed in a trickle of reluctant yes messages. Because nothing makes a bully blink faster than the person being honored choosing kindness with a spine. Though of course Aunt Carol took her time and then chimed in with a paragraph about how humor has always been part of our family culture and how she would hate to see good intentions policed out of existence. And I replied that intentions are not what people remember, outcomes are, and I asked again, gently, if she agreed to the boundary, and after a long pause that I could feel through the silence, she typed yes. And I knew I had already won something I had never managed to win before, which was not control over them, but control over the conditions of my presence. My father called to ask if this was necessary and whether I could not just trust that they would behave, and I told him that trust is not built on hope, it is built on pattern, and that I would happily rebuild trust when the pattern changed. And he did that sigh that fathers do when they do not want to admit that their little jokes have teeth, and he pivoted into logistics, because logistics feel safer than accountability, asking what I planned to bring and whether I needed help with pickup or setup, and I told him I would handle my contribution privately and that my help would look like something other than sugar this time, which he did not understand but accepted, because the group text had already created a record he could not argue with. The night of the engagement party arrived faster than anyone expected, and although every instinct I have learned from years of being the designated good sport told me to brace for the hit, I chose to walk in steady and unhurried and to speak to Jenna first, because I wanted her to feel like I was there for her and not for a fight, and the truth is that I really was, because my retaliation has never been about ruining anyone's day, it has been about refusing to let mine be ruined for sport, and for a while it went well, with neighbors asking the usual small talk questions and me answering with the kind of calm that comes when you know exactly where your exit is and what will trigger it, and I could feel Carol watching for an opening. Because people like her cannot stand a room that runs itself without their stage directions. It happened during a toast, because of course it did, with Ryan getting sentimental about finding the right person and then, unable to resist the pull of a cheap laugh, tossing in a line about how he hoped my secret husband would forgive me for flirting with the bartender, and you could hear the tiny rush of nervous laughter that always follows his jabs. The kind that says we know this is wrong, but we want to be on the safe side of the joke, and I did not flinch or bark back or make a speech. I did exactly what I said I would do, which was to place my glass down, step over to Jenna, hug her sincerely, and tell her into her ear that I wished them a lifetime of choosing each other even when it is uncomfortable. And then I walked out the door without asking permission or creating a scene, and I cannot describe the power of following through on your boundary in real time. Because it turns out the most dramatic move you can make in a family that feeds on drama is to refuse to feed it. Of course I had prepared, because precision is kinder than rage, so on my way out I stopped at the front desk and told the event manager that I had arranged a surprise, which was that the next hour of the bar had been covered and the tip had been paid in advance under my name with a note that thanked the staff for taking care of Jenna on her big night, and I asked that the message be read aloud when they announced the open hour. And I left a wrapped box with the registry's most coveted item in the manager's office with instructions to deliver it to Jenna after the toasts, which meant that while I was honoring my boundary by leaving, I was also taking away the one narrative they always reach for, the one where they call me petty or jealous or dramatic. Because I had supported the couple better than any of the people who stayed behind to gossip, and I had done it without allowing myself to be mocked in the process. By the time I reached my car, my phone was vibrating like a hive, my mother calling first, then Carol, then Ryan. And I let them roll to voicemail while I sent one short message to the group thread that said I had left per the agreement because a boundary had been broken during a toast, that I loved Jenna and supported their marriage, and that I would see everyone at Thanksgiving if the next family interactions matched the yes they had already typed, and within minutes Jenna replied with a heart. And a thank you for the gift and the bar, and a cousin I have not heard from in months wrote that I had handled that with more grace than anyone in the room deserved. And I sat there in the quiet and let the adrenaline drain. And I knew I had executed a move that would be hard for them to spin, because receipts beat rumors every single time. An hour later, Ryan sent a message that tried to pass his line off as a harmless joke, and I screenshotted his yes from the thread and sent it back with a simple note that said I am holding us all to what we agreed. And after a long pause that felt like the crack of something old splitting, he wrote that he was sorry and that he had not thought, and I told him that from here on out thinking would be the admission price for my presence, and that if the family could keep it together, I would bring my husband to Thanksgiving, which is to say I would bring the story they were starving for to a table that had earned it, and as I hit send I smiled, because I could already feel the room I had built for the final move. The moment where the truth would not just make them quiet, it would make them look at themselves, and nothing terrifies them more than that. Thanksgiving did not sneak up on me the way holidays used to when I was trying to be everywhere and please everyone and still somehow leave room for myself. Because in the weeks between the engagement party and that Thursday, I watched the family try on their best behavior like a suit they hoped would pass inspection, with careful texts that stuck to logistics, with a few small apologies that arrived without the word sorry, but at least landed without a joke stapled to the end, and with Aunt Carol quiet in a way that told me she had realized the spotlight could turn on her faster than she could spin a story, which meant the stage was set exactly the way I needed it, not because I wanted to cause a scene or humiliate anyone, but because I wanted the conditions to be clean enough that when I finally told the truth, no one could pretend they missed the point. I decided to arrive exactly on time and alone, not because I wanted to make an entrance, but because showing up with a prop or a decoy or even a friend would have given them an excuse to turn the moment into theater, and I was done with theater. So I walked in with a calm hello for my mother and a steady hug for Jenna. I handed Ryan a small envelope with the vendor confirmation for a service they had been stressing over that I had quietly paid in full, and I asked my father where he wanted me to put the stack of place cards I had brought, which made him blink because place cards imply intention and control, and he is used to those things coming from someone else. And I told him not to worry because these were not names, they were promises. And I placed one at every setting that simply read the word respect, because I wanted a visual reminder that could not be argued with later. A little piece of paper that would sit there while we all pretended we had not spent years turning each other into material. The meal began the way these meals always do, with too much talk about football and sales and recipes and a few test questions lobbed at me with fake innocence that I let roll past because I had no interest in getting sidetracked. And when the plates were down and the toasts were about to start, and I felt the room slip into that familiar rhythm where Aunt Carol warms up her voice and Ryan moves into his well-rehearsed charm, I stood, not loudly and not with drama, just enough to be seen, and I said that before anyone raised a glass I wanted to say something that would take less than a minute and would not ruin anyone's appetite, and they all quieted because nothing draws attention faster than a woman who is no longer apologizing for taking it. I said that a while back I told them I was married, and that ever since then I had watched them lean forward, not to know me better or to show up differently, but to confirm whether a man had finally signed off on my value, and that I had chosen to let them lean and to make them work for the details and to keep them out of a story they never treated with care, not because I enjoy games or because I am trying to win some point they do not even believe exists, but because I needed to know whether the only way to be respected in this family was to be attached to someone they ranked above themselves, and that tonight I was going to give them the only clarity that mattered, which was that there is no husband, there never was. There was only me choosing to see whether their respect could survive the absence of a man to anchor it, and that the little piece of paper at each plate was not decoration, it was the minimum price of admission going forward. The silence that followed was the kind that compresses your chest and makes you wonder if you should have softened the edges. And I will not pretend I did not feel the old instinct rise up that begged me to fill it with jokes or qualifiers or a quick pivot to the sweet potatoes. But I held the line, because softening is how I have lost myself every year of my adult life in this room. And I watched their faces go through the steps, surprise slipping into confusion, confusion into embarrassment. Embarrassment into anger for some of them and into relief for others, and I stayed steady, because I had not come here to punish anyone. I had come to set the floor and leave it in place, even if it meant leaving the room. My mother spoke first and asked why I would do something so dramatic when I could have just told them I wanted boundaries, and I told her that I had asked for boundaries many times and had been laughed off as sensitive. And that I had learned something uncomfortable about us, which is that the only time this family pauses and listens is when there is the possibility of public embarrassment, and that by letting them believe a story they wanted to hear, I held up a mirror to the exact values that have kept me small at this table, because suddenly I mattered when they thought a man might be standing behind me, and the second I removed him from the picture they had to choose whether I mattered on my own, and until tonight, they had not been tested on that choice. Aunt Carol tried to recover the wheel with his speech about tradition and teasing and how families have always used humor to cope, and I told her that humor is only coping when everyone in the room is laughing, that what we have been doing is not coping, it is cutting, and that the reason I set down my glass and walked out of the engagement party after a line that broke a clear agreement was not because I am fragile, it is because I finally refuse to be the entertainer that keeps everyone else comfortable, and I added, calmly because fury would have made it cheap, that the vendor envelope I handed Ryan would help close a gap she has been gossiping about to her committee friends for weeks, which means I am not here to ruin milestones. I am here to refuse the old terms. Ryan, to his credit, met me halfway, saying he had crossed the line at the party and that he had thought a joke would loosen the room the way it always had, and I told him that the room only loosened because I took the hit and smiled through it, and that I was not taking hits anymore, and Jenna, who has been listening with quiet attention since the moment I walked in, said that she wanted a marriage with boundaries she could defend even when it made the room uncomfortable, and that she understood why I had built this test and why I was ending it here, and that if anyone wanted to make me the villain of their story tonight, they would have to do it without her, and I could have hugged her again right there. Because sometimes the person who marries into a family is the only one brave enough to pull the brake. I said I had two simple things left to add, and then I would sit and let them toast the way they wanted, because I was not trying to hold the floor, I was trying to put it back in place. And the first was that the donations I had made in their names to the shelter Jenna volunteers with would stand whether or not they approved of my tactics, because generosity should not be a bargaining chip. And the second was that my presence at Christmas or any other gathering would come with the same terms I set for the engagement party, which are written on the cards in front of them and recorded in the thread everyone can reread, and that if the terms could not be met, I would leave quietly again with no scenes and no speeches, and no attempts to win anyone over. Because I am done campaigning for basic respect. There was a beat where I thought Carol might try to rally the old guard, where I could see her scanning the faces for backup. And what she saw instead were people looking at me in a way I had not seen since I was a kid, saying something smart before they taught me to make myself smaller for points. And when she finally exhaled and said that perhaps the jokes had gone too far and that she could retire the role of family MC for a while, I nodded once and accepted it without gloating, because the win I was after was never her humiliation. It was the end of a tradition that felt normal because it was repeated, and traditions end the minute someone refuses to keep repeating them. We ate, and we toasted, and nothing exploded, and I did not offer 1,000 little assurances the way I usually do to make everyone feel okay about my choices. I let the room carry its own weight for once. And after dessert I stood to help clear, even though I had promised myself I would not slip back into being useful as a way to earn my place, and then I put my coat on, hugged my mother who was still processing and still my mother, squeezed my father's hand as he muttered that he had a lot to think about, told Ryan and Jenna that I loved them and meant it, and when Carol approached with a half apology that sounded like a weather report, I told her I would measure change by what I heard next time, not by what I heard tonight. And I left before anyone could turn it into a scene. On the drive home, I waited for the regret that usually crawls in after a confrontation and starts building a case for why I should have softened or smiled more or picked a different day, and it did not come. And when I realized it was not coming, I understood that the plan I had held in my head for months had finally clicked into its last position, because I had not just proved a point, I had reset a system, and whether they keep it or break it is on them now. Not on me, which is the cleanest revenge I could have imagined, and I slept that night with the kind of quiet that does not need victories or witnesses, just the knowledge that I took my turn without asking for it, that I turned the table without flipping it, and that the next time someone asks loudly when it will be my turn, the answer will be simple and not up for debate, because my turn is whenever I decide to show up, and the only approval I need is the one I gave myself.